If you have open supporters of a terrorist group, and Hamas has been a prescribed terrorist entity in the UK for some years now, prescribed in its entirety. If you have some Hamas supporters in the UK, my suggestion is the UK does not either want or need them. It's also not that difficult. We have senior members of Hamas living in the UK, former members of the senior military leadership of Hamas living in the UK. This is the UK's shame. It isn't for the British government or any other government to tell the Israeli government how they should respond to the massacre of their civilians. But I do think it's important to just bear in mind that we can, in countries like Britain, or should, keep our own house in order. I see no reason why Britain should have for so many years been a retirement home for members of the revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran, one of whom, as I wrote about in the magazine recently, lives in Harrow. I see no reason why Hamas's backers should live in the UK, and I don't see any reason why their supporters should live in the UK. After Jews have been massacred for being Jews by Hamas in this ISIS-like fashion, treat the people who support that as we would the supporters of ISIS. And if you can't remove their citizenship and expel them from the UK, at least prosecute them and imprison them under the 2006 Terrorism Act for the glorification of terror. Look at what happened outside the Israeli embassy in London the other night. Crowds of hundreds of people. And again, yes, there is a blurry line here because a lot of people hide behind the idea that they're supporters of the Palestinian people when in fact they're just haters of the Jewish people. But look at the people who turned out the other night before Israel had done anything in terms of retaliation against Hamas. Hundreds and hundreds of people, notably young people, who were outside the Israeli embassy, which had to be boarded up, and they were screaming their hatred of Israel. Well, what were they doing? Were they preemptively opposing an Israeli backlash? No, of course not. They were rejoicing in the massacre of Israeli citizens. And as I say in the piece, this has erupted all across Britain. We have people in Brighton talking about how beautiful the massacre of Jews is in Israel and being applauded by crowds. We see in other countries, other democracies, the same way in which people have used our system and taken rights they would never give us in return. What about the people in Sydney, outside the Sydney Opera House, again, after the massacres, before any retaliation, chanting, "Gas the Jews in Sydney"? Israel has its problems, but we in the Western democracies have ours. And our main one is that we have people in our countries who celebrate terror. And I say, get them all out.
Well, I understand entirely what you're saying, and I agree with it to a large extent, but I just think there may be a difficult to sort of carry on this muddling point. There may be different laws that would need to be used here. One would obviously be terror legislation, and Hamas is a prescribed terrorist group. But the other thing we have to use would be hate laws. And I think there you get into difficult territory.
Well, hate laws are all weak. I don't particularly
saying anti-Semitic things.
I don't particularly believe in hate laws. I think hate laws are a sort of watery thing that lax and soupy governments imposed because they couldn't just impose the rule of law as it existed. So I'm not very interested in hate laws. I am interested in the glorification of terror and the proposition that people should be allowed to support terrorism in your country. Let me put it this way. Let's take something like an extremely rare but awful thing like, for instance, the Christchurch mosque massacre some years ago in New Zealand. Imagine if after that massacre there had been a protest outside the embassies of New Zealand around the world of people celebrating the lone wolf gunman who went and shot up that mosque. Would we be saying, well, they're just expressing a sort of, a right to free expression, or maybe they're objecting to the New Zealand government's potential to have a backlash against it? No. We would say, quite rightly, well, these people are obviously glorifying the terrorist. We all know that it would happen if it was that way round. We all know that. So why is it that the Jewish people have to be the one people in the world who are expected to be massacred and to have to respond with equanimity towards that? And when they're taunted on the streets of London and other capital cities across Europe, are meant to just sit back and accept it? We didn't take that view with ISIS. We didn't take it with Al-Qaeda. We shouldn't take it with Hamas.
Another debate that's sort of springing up on the domestic reaction here in Britain is this issue of projecting Israeli flags onto British government buildings or flying Israeli flags from British government public buildings. I wonder how you feel about that. I note that the Muslim Council of Mosques in London has written to the government expressing its horror at that, which I suppose is only to be expected. But I think a lot of people feel, and perhaps they're right, that public buildings shouldn't be used for the flying of any flag other than the British flag.
Oh, well, here's the thing, though, isn't it? After the Bataclan massacres in France, it was almost de rigueur for people to say, to fly French flags. And thank goodness we did an attempt to show, a weak attempt, but an attempt to show solidarity. In fact, when other attacks have happened across Western democracies, it's become a sort of norm to do that. You may like that or you may not. But here's the thing. Why should it be the case that, I mean, again, hardly surprising when we're talking about the MCB, but why should it be the case sort of lower down the food chain, as it were, that people would say, yes, of course we must show solidarity if it's the French who are massacred by Islamist barbarians, but if it's the Israelis who are massacred by Islamist barbarians, who's to say whether we should fly the flag of the country that suffered? I think if you've set the precedent of trying to show unanimity and solidarity with friends who've been massacred by barbarians in one country, you should probably do it with the others as well. But as always, there's an Israeli exception. An Israeli exception is that people endlessly think, oh, well, maybe it's going to be divisive. It's only divisive in the UK because we've let in an awful lot of people who support terrorism when it's done by the terrorists of groups like Hamas against the Jewish nation. So no, I mean, I think that anyone who sort of has a sudden problem with that now should have had a bigger problem with it earlier on. And I think that if they have a problem with it now when it comes to the flag of Israel, it tells us much more about themselves than it does about Israel.
Yes. Well, let's move on to the question of the questions about what's going on in Israel and the Holy Land. Paul, I'll come to you. You've got an typically excellent piece in this week's magazine in which you speak to various people who do know a lot about this. And the big question that everyone started asking as soon as this happened was the involvement of Iran, the extent of Iranian involvement. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were able to discover?
We should say, first of all, there's no proof of Iranian involvement. And in fact, the White House in the US says that American intelligence agencies are looking for that proof but haven't found it. So what you have is well-founded supposition. And the well-founded supposition says that Hamas already gets a lot of money from Iran, maybe $100 million a year, is well known to have received technical support from Iran, how to build bombs from everyday materials like pipes and fertilizer and sugar. And also, there have been a lot of meetings between senior Hamas figures and senior figures from the Iranian Quds Force, which directs Iranian foreign policy. So Joel Rayburn, who used to run Iran policy on the US National Security Council, and is quite a legendary figure in the Middle East to people who follow these events, says that to his mind, there's absolutely no doubt that Iran was behind this, because the Quds Force, when it has a client like Hamas, almost without exception, directs that client for any major initiative, tells that client like Hamas how it will be done, when it will be done. And in Rayburn's view, this was done for Iranian strategic reasons, not Hamas strategic reasons. And those reasons would be that Iran doesn't yet have a nuclear weapon, needs to cripple Israel, and by extension the US, needs to support Hezbollah, its militia in Lebanon to the north, and therefore wants to tie Israel down using Hamas. And rather worryingly, his view is that this also means that the Iranians will activate Hezbollah to attack Israel if it looks like Hamas will be destroyed and therefore Hezbollah will be isolated. That for Iran is a strategic imperative. All of that does make perfect sense, but there is as yet no proof of it.
Another interesting point that comes out of your piece is one Hamas figure suggesting, almost sort of accidentally suggesting that the attack was not entirely in their control. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
This is Osama Hamdan, who's a very senior member of Hamas, a member of their Politburo, who I must say seemed almost taken aback by what had happened and scrambling to catch up. And you can imagine that this was something kept very close to the military wing of Hamas in its planning. And then spokesmen and politicians like him have to run to catch up and justify it. I get a stream of Hamas press releases on my phone, the latest of which says that there were no atrocities. This is the Western media making things up. This is the Israelis making things up. These, of course, are absurd lies. There was mass murder. It's been well documented. And yet Hamas seeks to deny it. In his view, this was a military operation against military targets. And as he told me, the Israelis are playing up the civilian casualties because they are embarrassed about the extent to which there was a total collapse of their army around Gaza. And there was, in fact, a collapse. It was 12 hours, 24 hours before some of the Israeli towns, kibbutzes, that were under attack got help from the army. He's pointed out some videos such as a Hamas fighter apparently asking permission to take food from an Israeli house, a Hamas fighter apparently telling a woman and her 2 children, "We are Muslim, we will not hurt you." Again, the Hamas media machine is pushing out those videos this morning. But ultimately, and this is the justification you get from people I've been phoning all around the region, we've been killed. There's a double standard here. Palestinians are being constantly killed. And when we hit back, everybody sympathizes with Israel. What about the Palestinian dead? He also said something very interesting about Hamas being forced into doing this because of the rapid pace of settlement in the West Bank, which in his view made the possibility of a Palestinian state too remote ever to be achievable. And he almost felt this was the last chance to do something about that. Now, to those who disbelieve that particular argument, I also had a very similar argument from a former head of Mossad, the Israeli spy agency, Danny Yatom, who said, look, Netanyahu had a Machiavellian policy of cynically building up Hamas in order to weaken the PLO, which is the main interlocutor with Israel. There are no talks with Hamas, there are talks with the PLO. Netanyahu wanted to cripple the possibility of a Palestinian state and gambled and made a terrible mistake in building up Hamas in order to do that.
Douglas, I wanted to ask you about Israel making terrible mistakes. I mean, you put in your piece, the Israelis will respond as they see fit. It isn't for non-Israelis to give them advice. And I see that point. But also, if we feel Israel, our ally, may be making a great mistake in its response, may even be falling into a trap, possibly even an Iranian set trap, is there not some validity to the argument that by reacting as violently as they seem to be reacting, they are only, people talk about mowing the grass in Gaza. They're only creating the conditions for it to grow back even more ugly.
Well, first of all, I don't agree with the proposition that Israel has done anything significant or anything significantly bloody to date. And I can certainly say with absolute certainty that no Israeli soldier has yet gone in and mass gang raped and then stabbed and beheaded women in the Gaza. We're not dealing with the endless issue of this. It's a particularly British fetish, this weird fetish about proportionality in conflict. If there was proportionality in conflict, then it would seem that we would have to allow the Israelis to go and gang rape and behead the same number of women and children as the so-called fighters and militants, the terrorists of Hamas, did in Israel. So Israel hasn't responded with 1% of the barbarism that was shown on Israeli territory last Saturday, not a bit of it. What Israel does have to do is to reassert its own impenetrability, its own impermeability. And that is one of the many things that suffered such a blow at the weekend. The belief that Israeli intelligence is all-knowing took a huge hit. The idea that the IDF is endlessly able to defend the Israeli people against all enemies took a massive hit. The idea that tech can stand in for human beings at border crossings and so on took a huge hit. The technological prowess and much more has taken a huge hit. So the most important thing I should think that Israel would need to do is to build those things, even if they are myths, back up. And it should be allowed to do so. that might well include doing things which people sitting comfortably in other Western democracies think they oughtn't to do. But I would have thought that if, and again by proportion of population, if some tens of thousands of British people were massacred at the weekend at a music festival and house to house in small towns in a part of our country, I think we would be quite tired of people who said they were friends saying to us, now don't overreact, chaps, will you? Don't do anything bad. Hold it. I mean, there's something so insulting about the way in which people think, as I said earlier, that the one Jewish nation in the world is the one nation that is expected to just suck such things up. William Hague did it in the Times the other day. Don't fall for this trap, chaps. Well, there are lots of things that Israel could do, and it'll be very interesting in the weeks ahead whether people remember the initial atrocities that will have caused the war to come and keep them in mind, or whether those same people end up being the people who, particularly in Britain, always end up saying, oh, proportionality. We showed no proportionality in conflicts we've had in the UK in the past, and whenever Britain has been attacked. What do you think it meant in the Second World War when people sent home postcards saying, we didn't take many prisoners today? So, no, the endless urging of restraint on Israel is an endless urging that the international community does, because Israel is the only country in the world never allowed to win a war. That's why, by the way, you have the situation in the Gaza. You have all the international idiots telling the Israelis they have to withdraw. And then what happens? You give the Palestinians a statelet and they give you Hamas and war. Anyone who thinks the West Bank is going to be a Palestinian state is now living with the fairies. And it's not because of the Israelis. It's because the Palestinian Authority hasn't wished to create a state for decades. It never did. It's only ever been interested in creating a state from the river to the sea, as they always say. It's never been interested in a two-state solution. Palestinian Authority, under two leaders now, has repeatedly turned down every Israeli offer of peace. They were offered 99% of what they wanted just 15 years ago. They turned it down again, as Yasser Arafat did at Oslo. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, and that's a Jewish-cleared Palestinian state.
Paul, I wonder what you make of Douglas's point there.
I think the two-state solution is probably dead, which is a pity because it's the only solution which makes sense in the long run. Israel, I think, has begun intense bombing already and will have to go in on the ground, having destroyed the obvious targets. Hamas is this amalgam of both a state with government buildings to bomb and a guerrilla force, and the guerrillas have now withdrawn into the civilian population, which is being hit by Israel. Now, what Hamas did was a war crime. Murders were committed. This is against international law. But Israel is a state which at least pretends to be governed by international law. And this is one of the suggestions which came out in the horrible 24 hours of chaos and confusion when this happened at the weekend, was a former Israeli general called Giora Eiland, who was the southern commander, used to be in charge of Gaza, saying that what we should do is go in and literally poison the wells. 97% of Gaza's water comes from these saltwater wells, and it has to be purified in water purification plants. Giora Eiland, General Eiland, wanted to destroy those purification plants, saying, everybody will say we're deliberately causing a humanitarian disaster, and we will be doing that as a means to get our hostages back and destroy Hamas. Well, that would almost certainly be a breach of international law. It would be collective punishment. And this perhaps is the kind of trap which Hamas, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because Iran pushed them to do this, has set for Israel. A lot of Israeli strategists and people who've thought about this don't want a reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. They know that that way lies more misery and more bloodshed. And by the way, in the end, Israel's going to have to talk to Hamas, and probably is talking to them already through intermediaries about the hostages, talking through Qatar. There is the outlines of a settlement there. It's still the two-state solution, impossible as that seems now. It's even one which so-called moderates in Hamas, and this is an organization with moderates and hardliners like any other, it's a solution that some in Hamas do want eventually, despite the atrocities at the weekend.
I think, I'm sorry to disagree with Paul, but I greatly respect. I think it's nonsense to think there's any such thing as a two-state solution on the table. I don't think it has been. I think that it's been the sort of thing that a certain type of Western politician who hasn't been following it very closely thinks always is the perpetual answer. The truth is that nobody wants the Palestinian people. The Arab nations don't want them. If the Jordanians cared about the Palestinian peoples, they would have taken them in 50 years ago. If the Egyptians cared about the Palestinian peoples, they'd have taken them in from the Gaza many years ago. The Egyptians don't like them. The Jordanians don't want them. None of the other countries in the region want them. But it's very convenient for them to all make the Palestinians Israel's problem. I see no reason why the Palestinian peoples have to be Israel's problem. As I say, the Israeli people have learned a very unpleasant lesson in the last 17 years now, that if you give the Palestinians territory, they will give you rockets in return. And you can always find people like the general you just cited in the immediate aftermath of unspeakable atrocities of a kind not seen since World War II. You can always find somebody who will voice a particular vengeful opinion, but that's because there's vengeance in the air because an atrocity was committed. And again, if this had been done against the British public, if this had been an attack on Britain, I'd have thought we'd find a lot of vengeful people here. At least I'd hope so.
I think that's quite right, Douglas. I take that point. But I suppose the difference is Britain isn't Israel, and we are not surrounded by countries that wish to annihilate us. And so, therefore, Israel's response, a wise counsel might be not to respond in the retaliatory way that a lot of Israeli politicians are now suggesting.
Not to respond at all. I mean, for instance, why should Qatar be hosting the heads of Hamas? Why should Qatar not be held responsible? One reason I'll tell you right away is that Qatar has managed to buy up a whole load of influence in countries like this one. Nobody will talk about what should happen, which is, among other things, retaliatory strikes against Hamas leaders who live in Qatar. But, of course, Britain won't do that because Britain's been compromised, like so many countries. So, I mean, a lot of British politicians and others will say, oh, don't do anything that rocks the boat, Israel. And among other things, what they mean is, we've lost control of things, including parts of our financial system. We can't control the British streets. So don't you in Israel do anything that makes a mess of our streets. Well, again, that's not Israel's problem. That's ours. It's us who've been the idiots.
Paul, Douglas says nobody really wants a Palestinian state. Do you think the European Union wants a Palestinian state? It's thrown billions in support to Palestine.
Probably. I mean, this is, in one sense, Douglas is right. There is no two-state solution for the foreseeable future. But in another sense, it's the only game in town. And for instance, Danny Yatom, the former Mossad chief, said that with 500,000 settlers now in the West Bank and more being pushed in by the Netanyahu government, that was an attempt to make the two-state solution impossible. No doubt the Palestinians, or the PLO, as Israel's main negotiating partner, carries a lot of blame for that too. But in Yatom's view, this was Netanyahu carrying out a long-standing policy of some Israeli governments to try to annex the West Bank. And the response from Hamas, the bloody massacre that we saw last weekend, in the words of the Hamas spokesman who talked to me about it, was they felt they were being backed into a corner. That's their calculation. It's the innocent people who suffer in this. Palestinian children bleed too. On the first day of Israel's bombing, a family of 19 who'd fled their home because of a warning shot nearby to another building were in the building when it was hit by a missile. 19 people dead, mostly women and children. According to the AP reporter on the scene, didn't seem to be a military target there. Of course, this is what happens when guerrilla armies, which is what Hamas is, retreat into the civilian population. Of course, this is what happens in the built-up slums that constitute most of Gaza City. It may not be the aim of Israeli policy, although most in the Arab world will certainly think that it is. One of the dispiriting things in the 24 or 48 hours after the attack was looking at the Arab press and seeing almost no coverage of the Israeli victims. People's hearts were hardened right from the outset. And that's what I got in telephone calls with people. They feel they have their victims that have always been ignored, and now they're ignoring the Jewish victims. It makes you very pessimistic about any outcome.
One thing we can say with absolute certainty is that the soldiers of Israel are not going to be hiding among civilian populations and using the populations as shields. That is exactly what Hamas has done. It's exactly what the fighter terrorists of Hamas have done. It's their plan So, there's also an issue not only of proportionality, but of intentionality. And the intention of Hamas last week was to kill as many innocent people as possible. The intention of Israel very clearly, as has been shown in many engagements, is to kill as few innocent people as possible. That difference might seem academic to some people, but in it lies everything.